The Galactic Council chamber floated in the darkness between stars, and its massive crystalline walls had witnessed 10,000 years of alien politics. But today, something different was about to happen, and none of the proud alien races gathered inside could have predicted it. Admiral Jacob Hayes stood alone in the center of the vast hall, and his navy blue uniform looked small against the towering alien delegates who surrounded him on all sides, and behind him holographic screens showed images of burning colonies and destroyed ships, but the aliens barely glanced at them because they had seen such things many times before, and to them, it was simply how the galaxy worked. The Vrexian ambassador rose from his seat, and his massive reptilian body cast long shadows across the floor, and his scales shimmered with colors that changed like oil on water. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 conquered worlds, and he looked down at the human admiral with eyes that had never known defeat. The Vrexian waved one clawed hand at the images of destruction and dismissed them as if they were nothing more than children's drawings. And he said that humanity was new to the galaxy and did not understand how things worked here, and that the strong took what they wanted while the weak learned to survive or they died, and that was simply the natural order of the universe. Jacob stood perfectly still and his jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm and steady when he replied that where he came from, they called such behavior piracy and theft and murder, and that civilized people did not accept it as natural or right. The Kelthani representative clicked her mandibles together in what passed for laughter among her insect-like species, and her compound eyes reflected the chamber's light in 1,000 different directions, and she said that humans were children who had barely learned to walk among the stars and that they had been in space for only 2 centuries, while the older races had mastered warfare for thousands of years and perfected it into an exact science. Jacob pulled up more images on the holographic displays, and these showed the Mercy Station massacre, where 14,000 humans had died, and most of them had been doctors and nurses and patients, because Mercy Station was a medical facility that served colonists from 12 different worlds, and it had no weapons and no military value, but the Vrexians had destroyed it anyway. Commander Lisa Bennett sat at the human delegation table, and her red hair caught the light as she leaned forward and asked if the Vrexian Dominion was admitting responsibility for that attack, and for the raids on human colonies that had killed tens of thousands of innocent people. The Vrexian ambassador smiled, and his teeth were long and sharp, and he said that the Dominion admitted nothing, but that when superior species exercised their natural rights in frontier space, the lesser species should be grateful if they survived. The encounter and that death was simply a lesson about knowing your place in the galaxy. Lisa's voice grew sharp and cold when she pointed out that most of the dead at Mercy Station had been children and elderly patients who could not defend themselves. But the Vrexian only shrugged and said that weakness was not an excuse, and that the strong had no obligation to the weak. The other alien delegates around the chamber made sounds of agreement, and there were clicks and hums and warbles in 100 different languages, but they all meant the same thing, and they all believed that humanity was weak and foolish, and that asking for help from the Council showed how little humans understood about the way the galaxy really worked. The Vrexian leaned back in his seat, and his posture radiated absolute confidence, and he told Jacob that humanity had no concept of true warfare, because they had only fought primitive battles on a single small world with crude weapons, and that real warfare involved fleets of thousands of ships and weapons that could crack planets and strategies that spanned entire star systems. Jacob listened to all of this without changing his expression, and he had known this would happen because his superiors back on Earth had warned him that the Galactic Council did not respect weakness, and that humanity's recent arrival in space meant the older races saw them as nothing more than useful primitives who should be grateful just to be allowed to exist. The Archon appeared then, and its body was made of pure energy contained in a geometric field of force, and it served as mediator for the Council, and when it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, and it announced that humanity's complaint had been noted and considered and dismissed, and that the Vrexian Dominion's actions fell within acceptable parameters of frontier engagement, and that the session was now concluded. Jacob stood there for a long moment while the alien delegates began talking among themselves and dismissing the humans from their thoughts as if the matter was already forgotten, and as if the 14,000 dead at Mercy Station meant nothing at all. Then Jacob activated his communication device and spoke clearly into it, and his words were simple and calm, but they carried a weight that none of the aliens recognized, because they did not understand what was about to happen. He said that Ambassador Kate Sullivan should inform President Morrison that diplomatic channels had been exhausted, and that Authorization Sierra November was now approved, and that Protocol Crimson Dawn should be executed immediately. The alien delegates paid no attention to the human admiral's quiet words, because they were already busy with their own conversations and their own concerns, and they thought the matter with humanity was finished, and that the weak species had learned its place. None of them noticed when Jacob and Lisa and the rest of the human delegation left the chamber, and none of them thought about the strange message the Admiral had sent, and none of them wondered what Protocol Crimson Dawn might mean. Far away in the outer regions of the star system, a message was received by a ship that had been waiting in silence and darkness for 3 long weeks, and deep in the swirling clouds of a massive gas giant, the USS Valiant began to wake from its sleep. Captain Daniel Cross sat in the command chair on the Valiant's bridge and watched as his crew brought the ship's systems online one by one, and lights flickered to life across dozens of control stations, and the deep hum of the fusion reactors grew stronger and stronger until the entire ship vibrated with barely contained power. The countdown timer on the main screen ticked toward 0, and every member of the crew knew what it meant, and they had trained for this moment and prepared for it, and now it was finally here. When the timer reached 0, Daniel gave the order, and the Valiant rose up out of the gas giant's atmosphere like a monster emerging from the deep, and its weapon systems came online, and its engines burned bright and hot, and it turned toward the coordinates where the Vrexian fleet waited thinking. They were safe. The aliens had claimed to command war and to understand violence and to have mastered the art of destruction across thousands of years, but they were about to learn that humanity had spent centuries perfecting something they had forgotten. The Valiant jumped into hyperspace and vanished, and behind it, the gas giant's clouds swirled and settled as if nothing had ever been hidden there at all. Captain Daniel Cross stood on the bridge of the USS Valiant and watched the countdown timer reach 0, and his ship had been silent and dark for 3 weeks, hiding in the thick atmosphere of a gas giant, waiting for this exact moment. And now every system was coming alive at once, and the bridge hummed with energy and purpose. Daniel asked for a status report, and his voice cut through the sudden activity as crew members rushed to their stations and checked their instruments and prepared for what was coming next. Lieutenant Paul Martinez looked up from his tactical station and reported that all weapon systems were green and ready, and the railgun batteries were charged to full capacity, and the missile tubes were loaded with kinetic penetrators, and the point defense grids were active and online, and the ship was completely ready for combat. Daniel turned to his chief engineer and asked about the power systems, and Commander Helen Brooks smiled as she reported that the fusion reactors were running at 100% capacity, and the hyperspace drive was hot and ready, and they could jump on his mark whenever he gave the order. The communications officer was young Ensign Greg Miller, and he was nervous but steady, as he confirmed that Admiral Hayes's authorization codes had been received and verified, and that they were cleared to proceed with their operational orders and to do what they had come here to do. Daniel looked at the main view screen and watched the churning clouds of the gas giant fall away as the Valiant climbed toward open space, and she was beautiful. His ship and 800 meters of human engineering and ingenuity, and built not in the old shipyards of Earth, but in the newer orbital factories around Mars, and she was the first of her class, and the first of a new generation of warships. The aliens thought they knew everything about warfare, and they thought their thousands of years of experience made them superior, but they were wrong, and they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Daniel ordered the navigation officer to plot a course to the Vrexian staging area at Helios Point, and he wanted maximum combat speed and no delays. Lieutenant Amy Foster worked quickly at her station and input the coordinates with practiced efficiency, and reported that the course was plotted and ready, and that the hyperspace window would open in 30 seconds, and they would be there soon. Paul spoke up from tactical, and his voice carried a note of uncertainty when he reminded the captain that intelligence reports confirmed at least 30 Vrexian warships waiting at Helios Point, and that they were just one ship going against impossible odds. Daniel smiled, but there was no humor in his expression, and he said quietly that they would just have to make every shot count, and then he ordered the helm to take them in, and the Valiant leaped forward into hyperspace and left behind the safety of hiding. 3 hours later, they emerged from hyperspace into what looked like certain death. Helios Point was a strategic location where multiple trade routes crossed and intersected, and the Vrexian Dominion had built a forward operating base here in Clear. Violation of neutral space agreements, but the Galactic Council had ignored it, because the Council always ignored things that the powerful races did, and only punished the weak. Massive Vrexian warships hung in formation around a central command station, and each ship was the size of a small city, and bristling with weapons, and between them, fighter craft swarmed like angry insects, and defensive platforms floated everywhere, and the whole scene looked like a fortress that could never be taken. Paul worked his console quickly and reported that he counted 32 capital ships ranging from destroyers to a massive command dreadnought and approximately 500 fighter craft and hundreds of defensive platforms, and their total firepower exceeded human projections by 40%. Daniel said that was good because then the Vrexians would feel safe and overconfident, and Paul asked what he meant, but Daniel just ordered communications to open a channel on all frequencies, because he wanted everyone in the system to hear what came next. Greg Miller's fingers moved across his console and he reported that the channel was open and broadcasting to every ship and station in the entire system. Daniel stood up straight and adjusted his uniform and spoke clearly and formally, and he identified himself as Captain Daniel Cross of the United Earthship Valiant, and he informed the Vrexian Dominion forces that they were in violation of neutral space agreements and were directly responsible for attacks on human civilian targets, and that they had one chance to surrender immediately and submit to council jurisdiction. The response came quickly, and the Vrexian commander's voice was filled with contempt and mockery, and he laughed at the idea of one human ship making demands, and he said that Daniel would die now, and that humanity would learn the price of arrogance. Daniel said quietly that was the wrong answer, and then he turned to Helen and told her to remove the limiters from the reactors. In the engineering section, Commander Brooks pulled up the reactor control interface, and her hands moved with confidence. As she deactivated safety protocols that had been in place since the ship's first launch, and the Valiant's power output doubled and then tripled, and the entire ship thrummed with barely restrained energy. Daniel told Paul that weapons were free, and to fire at will, and what happened next would be studied and analyzed for years to come by military strategists across the galaxy. The Valiant's railguns opened fire first, and they launched depleted uranium slugs at a significant fraction of light speed. And these were not the flashy plasma weapons that the galaxy preferred with their bright colors and impressive visual displays, but instead were simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective kinetic energy. Weapons that the aliens had dismissed as primitive and outdated. The first slug punched through a Vrexian destroyer's shields as if they were not even there, because the magnetic fields were designed to deflect energy weapons, not solid matter moving at such incredible velocity, and the projectile passed completely through the ship's hull, creating a tunnel of destruction, and it exited the other side, and 3 seconds later the destroyer exploded as its reactor lost containment. Paul reported the target destroyed and said he was reloading and acquiring the next target, and his voice showed the first hint of excitement. The Vrexian fleet scrambled to respond, but they were used to fighting at long range with energy weapons that grew weaker over distance, and the Valiant closed to what they considered point-blank range while moving with acceleration that should have turned her crew into paste against the walls, but humanity had mastered inertial dampening technology, far beyond anything the galaxy had seen. Missiles launched from the Valiant's tubes, but these were not explosive warheads but solid slugs of tungsten, wrapped in minimal guidance systems, and hundreds of them streaked toward their targets, and each one was programmed to find its own victim. And the Vrexian point defense systems were designed to intercept energy weapons and traditional explosives, and they were completely overwhelmed by the sheer number of incoming projectiles. A Vrexian cruiser vanished in a flash of brilliant light as 3 missiles impacted its engineering section simultaneously, and another ship listed helplessly to one side as a railgun shot destroyed its command tower and killed everyone inside. Amy called from navigation and warned that the Vrexians were trying to surround them and form an engagement sphere to trap the Valiant, but Daniel told her to let them try. Helen reported from engineering that the reactors were performing beyond their specifications but were stable, and that they could maintain this output for another 3 hours minimum. Daniel said it was time for Phase 2, and he told Paul to activate the Nova mines, and Paul's fingers danced across his console. The Valiant had dropped hundreds of small stealthy devices as it entered the system, and now they floated throughout, the Vrexian formation invisible and waiting. And at Paul's command, they all activated at once, and each one generated a powerful electromagnetic pulse in a very specific frequency. The Vrexian ship's shields flickered and died, and their weapon systems went offline, and their fighter craft tumbled out of control as their engines cut out, and suddenly the mighty fleet was helpless and defenseless. Daniel gave one word, and that word was now, and the USS Valiant became a storm of pure destruction, and her weapons fired in a continuous stream, and ship after ship fell to her guns, and the aliens had numbers, but humanity had physics, and physics did not care about reputation, or historical military prowess, or thousands of years of tradition. Within 20 minutes, the Vrexian fleet at Helios Point was nothing but debris tumbling through empty space. The Galactic Council reconvened in emergency session, and the crystalline chamber that was usually filled with confident posturing from powerful species now buzzed with uncertainty and fear, and no one could ignore what had happened at Helios Point. Admiral Jacob Hayes stood once again before the assembled delegates, but the atmosphere was completely different now, and the holographic displays no longer showed burning human colonies, but instead showed the shattered remains of 32 Vrexian warships tumbling through space like broken toys. The Vrexian ambassador looked different than before, and his scales had lost their shimmer and turned a dull gray color, and his voice shook when he declared that this was an act of war and an unprovoked massacre of peaceful vessels going about their lawful business. Jacob's voice was cold when he asked if peaceful was what the Vrexians called a forward strike base that was positioned to launch raids on civilian targets, and he pulled up communication logs that had been recovered from the wrecked command ship, and they detailed plans for attacks on 6 more human colonies, with projected casualty numbers in the hundreds of thousands. The Kelthani representative's mandibles clicked rapidly in what was clearly distress, and she asked how one human ship had managed to destroy an entire Vrexian battle group when the Vrexians were supposed to be masters of warfare with thousands of years of experience. Jacob activated a new display, and this one did not show the aftermath of battle, but something far more terrifying to the assembled aliens, because it showed shipyard footage from Mars and Luna and Titan, and there were dozens of ships like the Valiant in various stages of construction, and some were even larger and more heavily armed. Jacob told the council that they had claimed to command war, but that they were wrong, and that they had optimized their tactics for one specific type of combat, and forgotten that there were other ways to fight. Captain Daniel Cross appeared via holographic projection and told the council members that he wanted to be very clear about what had happened at Helios Point, and that the human forces had given the Vrexian fleet opportunity to surrender, and they had chosen to engage instead, and what followed was not really a battle but a demonstration of capability. The Archon's energy field pulsed with colors that indicated confusion, and it said that Daniel had destroyed an entire fleet and asked how that could be called a demonstration. Daniel corrected the Archon and said that they had destroyed a fraction of a fleet using a fraction of their capabilities, and that the Valiant was actually a diplomatic vessel and their lightest warship class, and that humanity had destroyers and cruisers and battleships under construction that would make the Valiant look like a small scout ship. The chamber fell completely silent, and even the constant background noise of alien conversation stopped, and the implications of what Daniel was saying began to sink in and spread through the assembled delegates like ice water. Commander Lisa Bennett pulled up additional files and explained that for 10,000 years the galaxy had fought wars in one specific way, with energy weapons at long range and shields that deflected those weapons and tactics based on fleet positioning and gradual attrition, and that everyone had optimized everything for this single style of warfare. A crystalline delegate asked if humanity had not done the same thing, and Lisa said no, and explained that humans had spent 2 centuries fighting each other on Earth in wars that involved millions of soldiers and massive naval battles and aerial combat and armored warfare and strategic bombing and even nuclear weapons, and that humanity had explored every possible way to kill each other and refined those methods, and then decided never to use them against each other again, but kept all the knowledge and all the weapons and all the tactical doctrine. Lisa continued and said that when humans reached the stars, they found a galaxy that had forgotten the fundamentals of warfare, and that the aliens fought at long range because their weapons were optimized for it, while humans fought at close range, because kinetic energy was more effective at short distances, and that alien shields stopped energy weapons but did not care about solid projectiles, and that the galaxy waged war as a predictable science, while humanity waged war as an art form, perfected through centuries of brutal trial and error. Jacob added that humanity was not claiming moral superiority over anyone, but was simply offering a framework that had been developed through immense suffering, and they hoped it could prevent others from experiencing the same pain and loss that humans had endured. A small delegate from a species that humanity had barely encountered stood up and asked what stopped humans from conquering the galaxy, now that they had demonstrated such overwhelming military capability and superior tactics. Jacob's expression softened slightly, and he said that the same thing that stopped humanity from destroying themselves also stopped them from becoming conquerors, and that thing was wisdom earned through suffering, and that humans had learned that military might without moral restraint led only to ash and regret, and that humanity did not want to conquer anyone but wanted to trade and learn and share the stars, but would never allow themselves to be victims ever again. The Vrexian ambassador rose from his seat, and his posture was aggressive despite the earlier defeats, and he said that the Dominion was vast with thousands of ships, and that one human vessel's tricks could not defeat the full might of the Empire. Daniel interrupted and said that the Valiant was not alone anymore, and the view screen changed to show new sensor data, and hyperspace windows were opening throughout the system, and he announced that the USS Defiant and USS Resolute and USS Vengeance had just arrived, and that 3 more battleships were en route, and that Admiral Hayes was about to explain exactly what humanity expected from the Council. Jacob pulled up a document and projected it large enough for everyone to see, and he called it the Terra Accords, and explained that it was a comprehensive framework for peaceful coexistence in the galaxy, and it included provisions for mutual defense, and fair trade and protection of civilian populations and restrictions on military actions, and it was based on principles that humanity had developed after their own devastating wars. The Kelthani asked what would happen if the Council refused to accept these terms. Jacob said that if the Council refused, then Earth would withdraw from the Galactic Council and close its borders and build its own alliance with species who valued peace over power. And he made it clear that humanity would prefer cooperation, but would accept isolation over subjugation. The Vrexian ambassador hissed that some might call this blackmail. Lisa stood up and said that blackmail was attacking civilian medical stations and threatening more violence unless demands were met, but that what humanity was offering was negotiation, backed by capability, and that they were giving the galaxy a choice to either evolve beyond the culture of predation that had defined it for so long, or find themselves facing a species that had already evolved beyond it, and knew exactly how to fight those who had not. The Archon's energy field pulsed through several colors before settling on a deep blue, and it announced that the Council would need time to review the Terra Accords and discuss all the implications of what was being proposed. Jacob said they had 72 hours, and after that, humanity would begin implementing alternative strategies, and he told Captain Cross to maintain position and show the aliens that humans were not going anywhere. As the session dissolved into chaos with delegates arguing among themselves and forming small groups to discuss this unprecedented situation, Jacob allowed himself a small smile because humanity had the galaxy's attention now, and whether that translated to respect or fear did not really matter, because what mattered was that humanity would never again be dismissed as weak or ignorant or easy prey. The Terra Accords would change everything, and the old order was crumbling and a new one was being born, and humanity stood at the center of it all, not because they wanted power, but because they refused to be powerless. The Vrexian Dominion's response came not through diplomatic channels or peaceful negotiation, but through raw military action, and 48 hours after the destruction at Helios Point, a massive fleet emerged from hyperspace near the human colony of New Haven, and it was the largest military deployment that anyone had seen in recent galactic history. 300 warships materialized in formation, and at the center of this armada flew the Conquest, which was a dreadnought so massive that it registered as a small moon on sensor systems, and from its command bridge, Fleet Commander Zethak broadcast a message across all frequencies. Zethek told the humans of New Haven that they had 40 minutes to evacuate their colony before the Vrexian fleet demonstrated what true military power looked like, and he mocked Captain Cross and said that he had only destroyed obsolete border patrol vessels, but now humanity would face the real Dominion fleet. On New Haven, Governor Alex Murphy immediately initiated emergency protocols, and the colony's 300,000 residents began rushing toward evacuation transports, but there was not enough time. And the math was brutal and simple because they could maybe save half the population in 40 minutes, but the rest would die. Commander Rachel Kim stood in the New Haven Orbital Defense Station and watched the approaching fleet with determination, even though she knew it was hopeless, because her station had only 12 defensive platforms and 60 fighter craft and a civilian freighter that had not finished unloading its cargo, and against 300 warships it was completely futile. But she would die trying to protect the civilians below. Rachel ordered all pilots to their ships and told them to charge all weapons, because if the Vrexians wanted to kill innocent people, they would have to go through her forces first, even if it meant certain death. But the Vrexian fleet never reached New Haven. The hyperspace disruption was massive and created sensor ghosts across every detection system in the entire star system, and when space finally stabilized, 20 human warships hung in formation between the Vrexian armada and the colony world like a wall of steel and fire. Leading them was a ship that made even the Conquest look small, and the USS Independence was humanity's first true battleship, and she had finally arrived, and she was beautiful and terrible. Admiral Karen Foster stood on the Independence's bridge and studied the tactical display with calm intensity, and she was 52 years old and had spent 3 decades preparing for exactly this moment, and now it had finally come. Karen ordered communications to open a channel to the Vrexian fleet. Lieutenant Sam Cooper established the connection and reported that the channel was open and broadcasting. Karen identified herself as Admiral Karen Foster of the United Earth Navy and ordered Fleet Commander Zethek to withdraw immediately from human space, and she made it clear that this was his only warning. Zethek's response came quickly, and his voice dripped with contempt, and he laughed at the idea of 20 ships facing 300, and he called Karen arrogant and stupid, and told her to surrender now, and he would allow the colony to survive. Karen turned to her tactical officer, Commander Blake Mitchell, and told him to show Fleet Commander Zethek what human arrogance really looked like, and she ordered him to fire Pattern Theta. The Independence and her escort ships opened fire simultaneously, but this was not the limited engagement at Helios Point, because this was humanity's full military doctrine on display for the entire galaxy to see. The first wave consisted of what humans called screamer missiles, and they emitted powerful jamming signals while traveling at speeds that Vrexian targeting systems could not track, and hundreds of them streaked across the void and overwhelmed enemy sensors and created complete targeting chaos. Behind the screamers came the real weapons, and they were kinetic kill vehicles moving at relativistic speeds, and the Vrexian shields, which were so powerful against energy weapons, were completely useless against solid matter, moving at a significant fraction of light speed because the physics were simple and brutal, and force equals mass times acceleration, and at these velocities even small objects carried planet-killing energy. The first Vrexian ship to die was a heavy cruiser, and one moment it existed and the next moment it was an expanding cloud of superheated plasma, and then another ship vanished and another, and the Independence's railguns fired continuously, and each shot was guided by targeting systems that had been refined through countless simulations. Blake reported that the Vrexians were breaking formation and attempting to scatter and engage at multiple vectors. Karen said calmly that this was predicted response delta, and she ordered Countermeasure 7 to be executed. The human fleet split into 5 battle groups, and each one moved with acceleration that should have been impossible and inertial. Dampening technology was humanity's secret advantage because it allowed maneuvers that would have turned alien crews into paste against their bulkheads. Commander Helen Brooks watched from the Valiant nearby, and she whispered that it was not even close to being a fair fight. She was right, because the Vrexian fleet, despite its overwhelming numerical advantage, was fighting a war it did not understand, and their tactics assumed long-range energy weapon exchanges, and their shields were optimized for dispersing heat and redirecting particle beams, and their armor was designed to ablate under sustained laser fire. None of that mattered against kinetic weapons traveling at relativistic speeds, and the Independence and her escorts punched through the Vrexian formation like arrows through paper. Blake's voice carried concern when he reported that the Conquest was charging some kind of massive weapon, and the energy signature was completely off the scale. Karen had expected this because intelligence reports indicated that Vrexian dreadnoughts carried planet-killer weapons, which were massive directed energy cannons that could burn through a world's atmosphere, and Zethak was desperate enough to try using it. Karen ordered Blake to target the Conquest's weapon ports and use firing solution Charlie. The Independence pivoted with impossible grace and brought her main batteries to bear, and 6 railgun turrets each, firing depleted uranium penetrators, the size of cargo containers, synchronized their aim, and the shots left the barrels at temperatures hot enough to glow white even in the vacuum of space. The Conquest's shields flared brilliant purple, and they were designed to dissipate energy attacks, but kinetic rounds do not dissipate because they simply punch through. The first penetrator broke through the shield and created a cascade failure that dropped the entire defensive field, and the remaining 5 shots struck the dreadnought's hull and penetrated deep into its structure, and one of them found the energy weapon's charging chamber. The explosion was visible from New Haven's surface, and it was like a miniature sun that briefly outshone the system's star, and when the light faded, the Conquest was gone, and with it, Fleet Commander Zethak and 3,000 Vrexian crew members had vanished. The remaining Vrexian ships began to flee, and they broke off in disorder and jumped to hyperspace in panic. And the human fleet did not pursue because they simply held position as a silent declaration that humanity would defend its territory, but sought no conquest. Karen opened a channel to New Haven and told Governor Alex Murphy that evacuation procedures could be halted because the threat had been neutralized. On the colony's surface, Alex stared at the sky where minutes ago death had seemed absolutely certain, and he thanked Admiral Foster on behalf of everyone in New Haven. Karen replied that he should thank the engineers who built these ships and the scientists who developed the weapons, and every human who looked at the stars and decided that humanity would not be victims there either. She closed the channel and turned to her crew and ordered them to set course for the Galactic Council station because she believed the aliens were ready to negotiate now. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so crowded before, and representatives from 200 species filled every available space, and all of them watched the humans with new eyes, and the emotions were complex and varied, but indifference was no longer among them. Admiral Jacob Hayes stood at the central podium, but he was not alone this time, and Admiral Karen Foster stood beside him along with Captain Daniel Cross and Commander Lisa Bennett, and behind them, holographic projections showed the diplomatic and military representatives from every human colony and outpost. The Archon began the session, and its energy field cycled through colors that indicated deep uncertainty, and it said that they gathered today to address what had become known as the human question, and that in less than 1 month, humanity had demonstrated military capabilities that challenged 10,000 years of established galactic order, and the Council must determine how to proceed. The Kelthani representative spoke first, and her tone was vastly different from her earlier contempt, and she said that the Kelthani Collective wished to be among the first signatories to the Terra Accords, and that they believed humanity's approach to conflict resolution had real merit. A wave of similar statements followed, and species after species rushed to align themselves with humanity's proposals, and many who had remained silent during earlier sessions now competed to show their support, and the shift was obvious, and to Jacob slightly disappointing because they respected power, not principles. But the Vrexian ambassador remained defiant and said that the Dominion would never submit to regulations written by primitive species, and that humanity may have won battles, but war was measured in years, and sometimes centuries, and that the Vrexian empire spanned thousands of worlds and would never surrender. Lisa interrupted and pulled up real-time intelligence feeds and said that the Vrexian empire was contracting as they spoke, and that in the past 72 hours, 47 species formerly under Vrexian control had declared independence, and 6 Vrexian colony worlds had requested Earth's protection, and that the Vrexian military had lost 362 ships in total, and their economy was in free fall as trade partners distanced themselves. The Vrexian ambassador's scales shifted to pale gray, which was a sign of shock among his species, and the chamber erupted in discussion and confusion. Karen stepped forward, and her voice cut through the noise, and she said that the Vrexian Dominion was learning what humanity learned in their 20th century, which was that you cannot base an empire on fear alone, because the moment a stronger power appears, the entire structure collapses, and that humanity was not permanently stronger, but just the first to demonstrate that Vrexian military doctrine had fundamental weaknesses. Daniel added that other species would now develop kinetic weapons and study human tactics, and that in a decade or maybe less the technological advantage would be gone, but the principle would remain, which was that might alone was not right, and that empires built on subjugation were inherently unstable. The Archon pulsed through several colors before settling on deep amber, and said that the human delegation presented compelling arguments, but there were concerns about Earth assuming a dominant position in galactic affairs. Jacob had anticipated this and said that humanity did not want dominance but wanted partnership, based on mutual respect, and that the Terra Accords did not put Earth in charge but established principles of conduct, and that any species could propose amendments, and the goal was a framework that protected all members, not just the strong. An elderly delegate from the Solari Confederation, who was known for a philosophical approach to governance, spoke up and asked if humanity could share more about the lessons learned from their own wars and the wisdom they claimed to possess. Lisa stepped forward and pulled up images from Earth's history, and she showed trenches from the First World War and destroyed cities from the Second World War, and mushroom clouds over test sites, and the alien delegates recoiled at the brutality displayed before them. Lisa explained that on Earth humans had 2 global wars that killed over 100 million people combined, and that they developed weapons that could destroy their entire world dozens of times over, and that they reached a point where they had to choose between evolving beyond violence as a primary tool or facing extinction, and that humanity chose evolution but never forgot the lessons. She continued and said that humans learned that military strength was necessary, but insufficient, and that true security came from mutual cooperation, and that the rights of civilians must be protected even during conflict, and that might without mercy led only to cycles of revenge, and that these were not abstract principles to humanity, but were written in the graves of their ancestors. The chamber fell silent, and many of the alien species had never experienced existential conflict, because they had been parts of the galactic order for so long that war had become ritualized, and a game played by rules that everyone understood. But humanity came from a world where war had been total and desperate and ultimately transcended. Jacob said that the Terra Accords were based on these hard-won lessons, and that humanity was not claiming moral superiority, but was offering a framework developed through suffering that they hoped could prevent others from experiencing the same pain. The Vrexian ambassador, recovering some composure, asked what would happen if the Dominion refused, and whether humanity would invade their territory and conquer their worlds and prove that they were just another empire with better weapons. Karen's response was immediate and firm, and she said no, and that humanity would defend their territory and their allies, and protect civilian populations from attack, but would not invade, and that the Dominion's fate would be determined by the Dominion's choices, and if they continued raiding, then humanity would continue stopping them. But if they chose to reform, then humanity would help them transition to a new system. The Vrexian seemed genuinely confused and asked if that was really it, and said that humanity had the power to destroy the Dominion, and yet offered negotiation. Daniel said quietly that it was because humans remembered what it was like to be on the losing side, and that after their Second World War, the victorious powers could have destroyed the defeated nations, but instead helped rebuild them, and not out of weakness, but because they understood that lasting peace required healing, not just victory, and that it was possibly the most important lesson humanity ever learned. The Archon's energy field shifted through multiple colors before settling on bright yellow, and it said that the Council had never encountered such a perspective, and required time to fully consider the implications. Jacob said to take the time they needed, but that while they deliberated, humanity was implementing the Terra Accords within their own sphere of influence immediately, and that any species that wished to join them was welcome, and that they were establishing the Terran Alliance as an alternative to the Council's traditional structure, and that the galaxy could join them or ignore them or oppose them, but could not stop them from trying to build something better. Over the following weeks, the galaxy transformed, and the Terran alliance grew rapidly as species recognized that humanity's approach offered benefits beyond military protection, and human technology previously dismissed as primitive became highly sought after, and human cultural concepts like rule of law and democratic governance spread through regions that had known only authoritarian rule. The Rexian dominion did not collapse immediately, but began a slow transformation because without the ability to intimidate neighbors, it had to negotiate, and without the threat of force as its primary tool, it had to offer genuine partnership. 3 months after the Battle of New Haven, the Galactic Council formally adopted a modified version of the Terra Accords as the foundation for a new galactic charter, and not because they were forced to, but because enough species recognized that the old ways had led to stagnation. Admiral Jacob Hayes attended the signing ceremony and watched as representatives from hundreds of worlds added their marks to the document, and it was not perfect because there would be violations and loopholes and challenges, but it was a start. Commander Lisa Bennett joined him at the observation window and watched ships from dozens of species dock together at the station, and she asked if he thought it would hold. Jacob admitted he had no idea and said that on Earth it took centuries to develop international law and humans still violated it regularly, but having the framework mattered because it gave everyone something to aspire to even when they fell short. The aliens had claimed to command war, and then a human battleship arrived and the galaxy learned the difference between practicing war and surviving it, and in that difference lay humanity's greatest strength, which was not that they knew how to fight, but that they had learned why fighting should always be the last resort.